And that was quite a good segue there, because I mean, as Bill and Sam were talking about, advocacy and spreading the word is a really important component of this, of sort of what we're doing, and maybe one that's been a little bit less examined than donations. So that picture there is obviously the Ice Bucket Challenge. You might recognise it from 2014. So over 2.5 million videos on Facebook. Facebook alone were tagged with Ice Bucket Challenge. It raised over $100 million for ALS, or motor neuron disease as we call it here. And obviously, as many have pointed out, including Will McCaskill, it was a case of a successful campaign, a successful charity campaign, but it wasn't, really a case of an example of effective altruism. As Will said, the key problem, really, or one of the key problems is funding cannibalism. So it was great that they raised all that money for ALS, but as he says, certainly part of that probably came out of people's charity budgets and wasn't going to sort of the more effective life-saving causes. Still, I think it sort of illustrates the power of what we do online and how it can make a big difference. And I think Will has sort of pondered what might have been achieved, if the Ice Bucket Challenge was sort of directed at, deworm the world or sort of against malaria. So today, I really just wanted to do a brainstorm of methods that we might use to do good, better online. Many of us spend a few hours a day, I think, wasting time on the internet. And I guess I'm interested in how some of that time might be put to good use, especially for those of us who are students or on lower incomes, although I think as we saw yesterday, as Julia Wise has shown, that's certainly no barrier to giving a significant amount of money. But this is maybe some low-hanging fruit for us as EAs, and I think this is especially apropos because EA is really a digital native movement. So who am I to talk about this? So I'm doing a PhD in digital culture, but I don't want you to see me as an expert in that, because I'm not an expert in the marketing research, the comms research, persuasion, any of that stuff. So take all that with a grain of salt. Really, I guess more my expertise is as a freelance writer and sort of copywriter. So I've done some stuff for the BBC and The Guardian. I'm now doing a bit of freelance stuff for BuzzFeed. Speaking of which, here's my 16 listicle of 16 things you can do on the internet that are pretty much guaranteed to make the world a better place. Of course, I'm just kidding. So I encourage you again to be skeptical about everything I say. Really, just sort of wanting to start a conversation. These aren't tested for effectiveness, and maybe at some point we will be able to test some of this. But a lot of this is kind of common sense. I will refer to some relevant studies where I can. So I think a big problem, is that sort of in my area, certainly, there's a lot of doubt about the effects of media and social media. A lot of people say, it's lazy activism, clicktivism. The opposite camp says that social media can be really transformative and helped to sort of push forward the Twitter revolutions. Maybe the truth is somewhere in between. That obviously, social media and the internet can be effective tools for publicity, but they can maybe be ineffective. They can also have some negative impacts, sort of maybe creating movements with shallow engagement. I think, as I said, the good thing is the cost isn't very high. This kind of advocacy can be fun, social, creative. Even if it's not very effective, I think it's probably not cannibalizing your charity budget too much, or your other things you could be doing. Certainly, I think for me, at least anecdotally, I came into contact initially with Peter Singer's ideas through a copy of Practical Ethics, so not on the internet. But then everything since then I encountered was through initially forums online and then Facebook. So it certainly sort of worked for me. I think a lot of people have been converted through Peter Singer's TED Talk and sort of other sort of online resources. I'll refer later on to maybe some exceptions and some risks in online advocacy as well. I think it is possible to do bad online rather than good online, so we have to be watchful of that. And for this notion of sort of moral licensing that Will talks about, so this idea that we think that if we do just a little bit, we're kind of done with charity. So we've sort of clicked on a petition, whatever, that's us settled. So we sort of have to see this as a small step towards a bigger commitment or a lifestyle change. So without further ado, so a lot of these are pretty obvious, but just to kind of list them all. So researcher Zeynep Tufekci, she's talked about how she's looked at some of these movements, social movements forming through Twitter and Facebook, compared them with the old, say, civil rights movement in the US in the 60s, and looked at how those movements in the 60s had these close personal bonds. They were sort of photocopy or sort of manually printing these flyers in the South during those civil rights struggles. So I think it's good to build these strong, sort of ties online where we can. And I think I was having a conversation yesterday. I think EA movement is pretty good with this. So I guess I'm just encouraging you to go to your Facebook. And sort of friend and follow as many of your fellow EAs as possible. Certainly something that I do, and I've maybe friends with 100 or 200 people, and it means that there's a constant kind of background noise of issues, events, initiatives, and stuff to kind of keep me engaged. Another no-brainer, liking and favoriting stuff. I guess what's important here is that the affordances of Facebook mean that we can reach those who are edge cases. So there's this sort of idea in sort of communications research and sort of research into social media of homophily, where like-minded people tend to stick together. So Israel supporters sort of stick together online, Palestinian supporters stick together. They don't really talk to each other. And I think with liking stuff on Facebook, it does mean that you can reach people who aren't necessarily EAs, but might be willing to be sympathetic to that. Another no-brainer is obviously sharing and sort of retweeting a little bit more investment. So I think this is obviously important for signal boosting. The notorious Coney 2012 campaign, so really iconic example of ineffective altruism. That wasn't a simple video that someone just sort of dropped into the sort of sea of YouTube one day and sort of went viral. There was a network of people pushing that out who helped it spread. In fact, I think it's kind of a myth that stuff always just spreads organically online. It needs, in that case, it had a network of people who were sort of saying, yeah, I'm an advocate for this, I'm gonna share it among my network. So I think that can help. Again, it's pretty obvious, but it can be helpful. So sort of gradually moving up the level of commitment here. So joining and starting groups. So obviously the Effective Altruism Facebook group, your local group in Melbourne or your local university. 80,000 hours, effective animal altruism, giving what we can. The various sort of NGOs working in this area, or that sort of a sympathetic. Also, consider starting your own Facebook group at your university or workplace. And if that's a bit of a stretch, I think many places would be sort of too small to support something like that. A group for those who are sympathetic, as I said, to sort of EA ideas. So, an animal rights group, a group sort of committed to alleviating global poverty, for example. There we go. So posting, tweeting, commenting, editing on a range of platforms. Again, this is pretty obvious, but Facebook, Twitter, Tumblr, Reddit, book review sites, Amazon reviews. Facebook really rules, the social web at the moment. So I'd be, in the first instance, usually thinking about Facebook to reach as many people as possible. But Twitter can also be useful, I think, for sort of getting into a conversation, a sort of more of a public conversation, particularly about public policy. So I think a great example of this recently is the Black Lives Matter movement transpiring in the US. Individuals like D. Ray McKesson, who I think have really pushed this sort of concerns about racism and sort of police brutality to the front of the political agenda. And I think probably EAs have quite a bit to learn about these sort of older style, or sort of traditional social justice movements that maybe we haven't engaged with yet. On a smaller scale, just posting, tweeting, commenting can help to change just one mind. And if you change just one mind, well, potentially you've doubled the impact that you've made over your whole life. There's another example of something you can do. You can edit Wikipedia. I think this page has obviously been tremendously effective. I know one EA who sort of created and edited a range of pages on sort of animal suffering, animal rights, sort of found that there was a gap there. I think when you're talking online, again, it doesn't have to be about EA. You can help sort of, help the cause of effective altruism, and you don't have to be talking about EA. So for instance, here in Australia, the Ozpol hashtag, is where people gather on Twitter to talk about politics. And, I occasionally see, maybe once or twice, I've seen people try and sort of talk about, EA on there, and, it's never really very high impact, but that's because you have to pick your audience. And I think if you're going on there, you'd more be talking about issues like, the huge $12 billion cuts to foreign aid, climate change, etc. So joining effective campaigns, this is really just an idea, that there are, the major NGOs have online campaigns like Oxfam Trailwalker. This could be a good place to, find and start conversations about EA. Take this one with a grain of salt. I think the jury might be out on this one. So, these online petitions were really emblematic of, slacktivism and clicktivism, but I thought I did need to mention them. They probably can be useful for starting a conversation. I think they're also really used for fundraising. So you have organisations like GetUp, Avaz, etc. In the first instance, it's about signing a petition, but also it's ultimately about sort of building a movement and raising funds, and applying political pressure. I think moral licensing is maybe a concern there. This idea that like, oh, okay, I've clicked on a petition, I don't have to do any more. On the other hand, I think there's a little bit of research I've seen that suggests that that's not the case, and that these sort of small acts can be a entryway into a sort of a deeper involvement in the movement. But that's not my area. I mean, I do wonder whether it's worth EAs considering forming a type of movement akin to these quite successful sort of petition-based groups like Avaz and GetUp, All Out, Move On. Maybe something to consider one day. Blogging. So, there's a few prominent EAs who blog. Julia Wise, as mentioned yesterday, Rob Wiblin. You don't have to blog on a traditional blogging platform. So, Medium, BuzzFeed community, there's plenty of other sites you can go to, as well as the obvious ones like WordPress, or even just Facebook. I mean, it's my anecdotal observation that people are increasingly staying on Facebook for their content, using it as a content delivery system. So a little bit different from maybe a couple of years ago when the blogosphere was this sort of thriving ecosystem. I think now we often get our content through Facebook, which means that maybe blogging is as simple as doing a sort of extended post on Facebook. And I think if you're interested in this area and you're good at it, have a chat to maybe Kerry Vaughan from the CEA. He was talking about perhaps starting a blogging project. So very similar to blogging is sort of publishing. So we live, I think, in the age of the think piece. Which has got a lot of criticism, but I think think pieces are actually perfect for EAs because it is an idea that sort of needs 700 or 800 words sometimes to communicate and sort of to broach some of the possible objections. It's also a good time to get involved in freelance writing. I think, never before has it been easier for people, with no publishing experience to get published. Maybe because, they don't pay as much now, so there's a sort of lower barrier to entry. We're talking here about the sort of journalism of conviction, as Habermas called it. So getting into the public sphere, making the case in an intelligent way. And I guess the difference here, with blogging is that, you're on a platform with more of a higher profile. It obviously gives you a boost in terms of your, audience, your page views, your virality, and it gives a sort of a bit of prestige that maybe, blogging doesn't have. Makes people listen to you a bit more carefully. Who to publish for? Range of options here in Australia. Fairfax, so The Age, the Sydney Morning Herald. Youth publications like Junkie, The Guardian, local papers. There's sort of online blogs like Overland. Overseas, or I can maybe talk to them outside if you sort of want to have some ideas about overseas publications. But you don't have to think in terms of these national publications. There's the university paper, professional journals, student journals. In say law or medicine or real estate or whatever it is. The LGBT press, arts publications, animals publications. Your company's sort of internal communications. So many of these look like they might not be appropriate, but I think you can sort of work out a way of pitching an EA message to those various sort of specialist publications by finding the link. And I don't think it's a stretch to find the link between EA and the law, or EA and medicine. There's an example of one I did for The Guardian on caged eggs. So again, EA articles don't necessarily mention EA, although I have. And this one I think I pitched to the typical middle-class Guardian reader who, they go to a upper middle-class cafe and they eat, brunch, and the brunch has eggs in it, and the eggs was probably from a caged hen. So here's another example, a great article by Will McCaskill. Maybe an example of how you can get creative with EA ideas. There's a really huge range of angles you could take. I encourage you to take them. 5 minutes, cool. It's not about doing an explainer on EA, although I think we are still at that stage. But really, there's a huge galaxy of options for you. Memes and shareables. I don't want to make too much of this. I don't make any claims to the effectiveness of this kind of communication. Just one I found on a Google image search. We have seen some memes around aid. Particularly, there's a lot of vegan memes. I think really, I don't know how persuasive these are. I think they are good at sort of building a movement, building sort of solidarity. We saw in Australia some memes to do with, the federal budget and income inequality. I wonder whether these are worth trying out for EA. And you can put them together in like 5 or 10 seconds. Thinking visually. So if you're not a writer, consider other forms of communication. So a climate change cartoon from Sam Wallman, not particularly an EA, not really EA necessarily a cartoon, but just an interesting cartoon on climate change that expressed quite a subtle idea. Sam's ideas about resistance to climate change, grassroots resistance, that was expressed in the form of a cartoon webcomic, and infographics, probably more to the point. I think these have traditionally been used by EAs, and I think they're a promising tool. Moving up the ladder of commitment, viral videos, I think have lots of exciting potential. These are a sort of a high investment, though. They probably to do them well, you need a little bit of money. You need some people involved. I'd caution about that, because if you're spending money, maybe the money's better off going to deworm the world rather than a gamble like this. If you are interested, maybe have a chat to me later. I'd be interested in sort of starting off a group dedicated to brainstorming ideas like this. And I think what we're looking for here is kind of, pranks, experiments, time lapses, sort of surprising takes on the sort of EA idea. We might have to do a few before one really works, but I think if it does work, that could be, really effective. Again, I don't know about this idea, but I thought I'd mention it. There has been quite a few sort of participatory memes. They don't really have a term in the literature. The Ice Bucket Challenge was one of them. This was a sort of participatory meme during the Gaza war, actually promulgated by both sides sort of simultaneously. This is a bit speculative, but that maybe is room for EAs to start thinking more in terms of a sort of participatory exercise. I know one scholar in this field has said that can be helpful in sort of spreading an idea when people, proactively do something to sort of spread the idea. Code something. I know there are a few people here in computer science. So games, toys, bots. Here's one used in the sort of federal election context. You might remember. But this is probably a bit more apropos from the Giving What We Can website. I mean, I know I've sent this to about 10 people, and so thinking outside, pictures and words, you might actually be coding something. Getting creative. I've been pretty skeptical, very skeptical previously about the role of art and creativity, even though I sort of am involved in that area. But there have been some. They were even mentioned yesterday. Some sort of quite famous creative works. Here's Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin, and of course Charles Dickens' works on child labour that I think have made a difference. So I'm not sure that we'd be writing a novel these days, but comedies, YouTube videos, games, visual arts, maybe an area to investigate. And the obvious one is giving online, but giving in that sort of evangelical way, possibly. So not just giving, but maybe telling people that you have given. Have I got enough time? Do you want me to wrap it up? I can have a chat with you afterwards. I had some pointers on the sort of tactics that we might use, or the sort of things we might think about when we're communicating EA. But if you want to have a chat, maybe hit me up afterwards. Thanks very much.